In this video, I want to go over the different options we have in the options and settings for FL Studio so that we can go ahead and get the program set up and ready to use. It's important to make sure you have the correct settings for your computer and hardware so that you can maximize your enjoyment and the usefulness of FL Studio 8. To get to the settings, simply left-click on the Options menu item from the File menu and select any one of the 4 items listed under System, or you can use the keyboard shortcut F10. Once we have our settings window open, we can customize our experience. To begin, we can select the MIDI option and set up any MIDI devices that are attached to the computer. If you don't have any MIDI hardware, this section may not apply to you, but it's good information to have in case you decide to purchase a MIDI keyboard to use in FL Studio later. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial to give a full explanation of MIDI, but in a nutshell, MIDI is a way that computers interface with musical components. MIDI keyboards do not usually make any sound on their own, but when they supply MIDI data to a host application, that data can then be outputted using VST instruments or soft synths. Up here, in this first area, we can choose how we want our MIDI output to be routed. You can choose any devices you have connected and route them to a specific port, or just leave the port alone and you can route things later to a specific synth. We'll see this again once we get into the step sequencer. The Send Master Sync option here can be chosen if you want to make FL Studio send the master sync signal to the chosen port or device. In order to do this, we need to make sure that the Enable MIDI Master Sync option is chosen in the Options menu under the MIDI section. We also have the option to change the synchronization type if we're syncing. Down here in the Input section, we would see any MIDI controllers that Windows has detected. It may say USB controller, or it may have the name of the controller. It all just depends on how the computer is reading your particular keyboard. If you have a controller plugged in but you're not seeing it listed, you can click on the Rescan button. You can see if your keyboard is sending MIDI data by hitting some keys and watching up here in this area. If you see this little light blinking red each time you press a key, you know that FL Studio is receiving the MIDI data. We also have the option here to select specific controllers that FL Studio has already integrated into its setup. If you're using one of these controllers on the list, select it and its advanced features, such as extra knobs or jog wheels, will already be mapped and active. If your controller is not on the list, you can always use the generic controller option. You may need to consult with your manual to find out how to map keys and controls. Below all this, we see options for Auto Accept Controller, which you may want to uncheck if you'll be using different controllers. Support Hold and Sustain, which allows you to use a foot pedal, and Record to Step Sequencer, which will record into the step sequencer directly rather than the piano roll. As we go through the step sequencer and the piano roll, you'll be able to decide what works best for you, but for now, I would recommend leaving this option off. Beside all this, we have options to set up the keyboard's keys to use for moving between markers in a song. You can take a look at the help file under MIDI settings to see the exact mapping for these functions. You can also use the keyboard to mute and unmute channels by setting the generator muting channel. Finally, the Toggle on Release function allows the changes you have taking place to happen when you press the key down and then revert back when you release the key. You will need to press the key twice to have the action occur. Finally, at the bottom here, we can adjust the velocity to a fixed value or a curve. Clicking on Curve allows you to create a custom setting for all notes. The next thing we need to do is set up our audio. We can left-click on the audio icon in the menu to the left and we will be brought to our audio options. By default, ASIO for all is the default driver. This can be changed by selecting a different driver from the menu up here. Now, before we start setting anything, I want to quickly talk about the difference between ASIO and Direct Sound. Direct Sound, for most people, is their default installed sound card or chip. ASIO stands for Audio Stream Input Output. ASIO is basically a way for your computer to communicate directly with your sound card and thus reduce the latency. ASIO for All is a driver that allows people who do not have an ASIO-enabled sound card to use ASIO instead of Direct Sound. How you set up this section is going to depend on your computer and your sound card. We'll go through and discuss what options are available, and then it will be up to you to determine what gives you the best balance of performance and usability. Since ASIO for all is the default selection, we'll explore its options first. To see these options, left-click on the button that says Show ASIO Panel. This opens up ASIO for all's Options panel. In simple mode, we can see what devices are available. In this case, we see my sound card showing as SIS7012 audio driver. We can see the legend to the right, which will tell us the different symbols for the different states of availability. If you wanted to disable a device from the list, just left-click on it and then select Disable. This will put an X over that item. You can enable the device using the same process. The most important part of this panel, though, is the buffer length. The buffer length will determine latency and buffer underruns. A smaller buffer setting means less latency, but will push the sound card harder and introduce the possibility of buffer underruns, which basically means the sound card can't keep up with the audio, so the playback becomes staticky and glitchy. A longer buffer time means better performance, but a longer latency. What I suggest is if you're not planning on actually playing anything, meaning you're not using a MIDI keyboard and you're not planning on using the typing keyboard feature to record, I would use the highest buffer time possible. You may notice a slight delay between the time that you hit play and the time that the sound comes, but again, this will give you the best performance. To see the advanced options for ASIO for all, please see the included documentation in the directory that you installed it into. Next, we can take a look at using direct sound. Again, we'll go to the list and select our card. Once again, we can adjust the buffer length and the same rules apply. If you're needing lower latency, try to get the smallest buffer you can without introducing underruns. But if you're more concerned with performance and not latency, then choose the highest buffer setting. You'll have to play around and do some testing to see what works best for you. In my case, I can usually get away with 512 samples as my buffer, which gives me a 12 millisecond delay. If you find that sometimes on a song that uses a lot of effects and sounds, you start getting glitches, you may need to increase the buffer length. Sometimes songs are so resource intensive and use so many sounds at once that it is necessary to up the buffer setting. Keep in mind that the buffer length can only be increased so far. At a certain point, your computer speed and sound card can only take so much. Once you've reached the height of performance on your computer and with your settings, you may still encounter problems with overdoing it. If that's the case, it may be time to look at upgrading your system. So the other options we have here are Auto Close Device, which basically frees the device to use for other applications if not running, or if FL Studio is not the focus program. If you use ASIO for all, you won't be able to hear audio from any other program while running FL Studio. The other options down here are Use Polling, which is supposed to give you a smaller buffer length with better performance, but it actually can work the opposite way for some people. I used to keep it on, and when I would get to a smaller buffer size, I would start to see that underruns started counting up. One day, I decided to turn it off, and sure enough, I was able to get a much lower buffer setting with it off than with it on, so you might need to experiment and see what works best for you. We also see an option for Use Hardware Buffer. Again, this is something I leave off as my sound card technically doesn't have a buffer. If you have an advanced sound card that has a hardware buffer, you may try this setting, but again, if you don't have a hardware buffer and you leave this setting on, you may see buffer underruns. Finally, we have Use 32-bit Buffer. This uses a 32-bit floating point buffer in Windows XP or higher. Again, I leave it off simply because I don't have any need for it. If you have a computer and a sound card that can handle it, feel free to use it as it will deliver a better quality sound. But my concern when using FL Studio is to be able to get the best possible performance and tack on as much as possible with no problems, and I select the highest quality settings when I actually render my track. So that way I still get the best possible quality I can and continue to work and create without limitations. I would also keep priority set to highest. This means that FL Studio gets top priority when running programs and that it will get CPU before any others. This also means that the audio engine gets top priority as well. You can choose to turn off the Safe Overload setting if you feel confident about your graphics card. Safe Overloads basically means that the GUI, or the graphical user interface, will not freeze up if there is an overload. Turning it off means that more CPU is given to the audio and not the GUI. So again, if you have a graphics card that you feel confident about, try turning the Safe Overloads button off. Over here in the mixer section, we've got different sample rates to choose from, as well as different interpolation methods for samples. Again, I would leave the interpolation on the lowest live setting, for instance linear, so that you can work without problems. Then, when you do your final render, you bump the settings up. We'll discuss more about exporting later. You can choose a higher interpolation method, but with each step higher, performance is going to suffer. As far as the sample rate, I would leave it at 44/100, which is standard definition. If you change the sample rate, you may receive a message stating that your sound card cannot support a higher sample rate. If you have external hardware or are using a sound card that can support it, feel free to change this option. The Reset Plugins on Transport option will reset all plugins. This is to clear out any potential audio hiccups that might occur if a synth is in the middle of an arpeggio sequence or maybe a delay. Enabling this option may cause you to have an added delay with some plugins each time you stop and start, so you may want to try keeping it off and see if it helps. You can choose the mixer as playback position if you're having problems with indicators. If you aren't having any problems, I would leave this option off. Finally, you can set a particular mixer track to use when you preview samples and for the metronome. By default, this is the master track, but this would be helpful if you wanted to try sounds out with a particular effect or EQ setting until you found what works best. We'll cover the previewing and browser later. In the next item, under the General category, we have our different options for how the program works. You would probably want to keep FLP files associated with the program. Show channel activity meters is a good thing to keep on, as it allows you to see what's playing at what time. We'll take a look at these in the step sequencer video. For now, let's just leave them on. Auto Name Channel will use the sample name as the channel name when you insert a sample. Auto Zip Empty Channels will zip any channel that is left empty when changing patterns. Auto Select Linked Module will automatically select the particular mixer track that is associated with the channel when you select that channel. So if I have a snare drum that is assigned to mixer channel 6 and I click on the snare sample channel, mixer channel 6 will automatically be selected. Use both buttons in the step sequencer allows us to add notes with the left click and delete with the right click. This is entirely up to user preference. Use Tablet PC or Stylus only applies if you're using a tablet PC. The alternate meter scale changes all meters from 3 decibels to 1.2 decibels peak. Ultra smooth visual feedback and smooth scrolling are simply visual effects that will make transitions smoother. Multi-threaded support is for computers that have more than one core or CPU. This doesn't work on all generators or effects plugins, but may boost your performance. Under the Advanced tab, the Don't Limit Windows to Screen is great if you have multiple screen support. You can drag the different windows around to create space. Fast Sample Preview means FL Studio will basically stream the sample instead of loading it into memory in order to preview. This can be problematic when previewing large samples. Auto Keep Long Audio on Disk will stream large samples from the disk rather than load them into memory. This again can cause problems if you're going to have a lot going on or if you're streaming multiple samples. I would keep this option off unless you don't have much memory. We also have the option to include the old included effects from earlier versions. These are pre-computed and can be found in the Sample Properties window in the channel settings. Below all of this, we have our undo levels. The higher this number, the more performance is going to suffer, but keep in mind, if you set the number low and you get into a bind, you may not be able to undo. By default, the undo function does not read knob tweaks. You can check the switch that says undo knob tweaks, but again, the more the program has to remember, the more performance will suffer. Then, at the bottom here, we have the skin chooser. While FL Studio is not meant to be skinnable, you can alter the artwork files included with the program. I actually discussed this more in depth in a previous tutorial series entitled FL Studio Tips and Tricks with Andrew Rusnak, which is available through grooveboxmusic.com and major music retailers. But the skin chooser allows you to view some altered artwork files included with FL Studio, such as alternate knobs or a different set of step buttons in the step sequencer. This, again, is down to user preference and can be changed back by choosing the default setting. Lastly, we have our file settings. In the first section, you can set extra directories for the program to search and catalog. You can add up to 10 directories. Once added, these directories will be shown and searchable in the file browser, which we'll take a look at in a bit. Below this, we have a place where we can specify an extra VST plugin directory. Plugins in the folder you select will be found the next time you do a folder scan, which again we'll discuss later. The only other information you need to take note of is down here in the project settings. Just left-click on Project and you'll be able to enter all the needed info for the particular track you're working on, such as title, artist, and any additional info. One cool thing about this is that you can display rich text format, and you can select the Show on Opening box so that when you start your project, a slightly translucent box will pop up showing you the info for the song. Lastly, below this, you can select the time signature and the PPQ, or the pulses per quarter note. PPQ is a factor that determines how refined you can get event edits, automation, and slides. The higher the number, the more fine control you have, but the more CPU is used. We also have the option for circular panning law and triangular panning. Circular panning helps to keep the volume level the same as you pan by decreasing the volume of both speakers as you get closer to the center. Therefore, the volume increases as you pan back and forth, giving the illusion that sound is not being lost the harder left or right you pan. You may want to do some extra research on your own on the pros and cons of circular panning versus triangular panning. So we've just covered a lot of information. I hope that I didn't move too fast, and if you need to review anything, feel free to go back and watch this video again, or view the help file by pressing F1. The topics we just discussed are meant to help you get the most out of FL Studio and can be changed at any time by pressing F10. You may want to try different settings to see what you like more or what gives you the better ratio of performance to quality. Making sure all of the setup information is correct may be more boring than making music, but it will pay off later as it will save you time and headaches. In upcoming videos, we're going to take a look at the layout and individual windows of FL Studio.